Someone is gonna hate this video. Welcome back. It's been about almost a year now, but we're back. My name is Sandro. I talk about tabletop RPGs. I make tabletop RPGs, and today I want to talk about setting agnostic tabletop RPGs and why I'm not the biggest fan of them, and some issues that I think could be remedied and are worth thinking about, is the full title of this video. I'm going to be super real with you all. I took a bunch of extra shifts in the past 2 weeks, so I'm exhausted in many capacities, but I did really want to talk about this, and I've been thinking about this a lot, and even though I don't have a script, I think this is going to go well, so I thought I'd just get it all out after my last shift at, it's already 1 a.m., and we haven't even done the editing. So let's just get right into it. First off, what is a setting agnostic tabletop RPG? Kind of like what it sounds like, it is setting agnostic, so it can be run in any setting. A lot of the time, people will talk about Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and they'll be like, oh, well, you could, like, hack it and run it in any setting. It's so flexible. And then, like, a bunch of other people will be like, oh, you should be using Fate or GURPS or Savage Worlds, and those are great for any setting. And I'm here to be like, all of those are not good solutions. I mean, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is probably the worst solution there, but also, my argument here is that setting agnostic tabletop RPGs are 9 out of 10 times not the way to go, and there's like 2 exceptions. One of them is Harmony Drive, and one of them is Fortnite. Okay, but let's back up a little bit. Let's start with why I don't enjoy setting agnostic tabletop RPGs and why I don't think they're always the solution. So my biggest issue, right, is that a tabletop RPGs is a collection of systems, and in fact, there's a lot of really good dialogue about, like, you know, the different kinds of systems there can be, whether or not system matters, like blah, 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 blah. I actually don't like the phrase system matters, because I'm kind of coming at this from a video game approach where, it's, like, system kind of matters, but it's more about mechanics. Mechanics are systems. In my opinion, they're different things, and it's also not about whether or not they matter, and it's more about the message behind them and what you're trying to do. But okay, the gist, right, is that generally in a tabletop RPG, if you are trying to go for a specific setting or a specific mood, there are certain mechanics and certain gameplay styles that are going to be more conducive to playing that and are going to sort of do some of the work for you and get you into that mood a little bit better. Dang, this is very rambly. Most of the videos won't be like this. Now, this isn't to say that you have to play with a system. There's a lot of, like, really good discourse about, you know, like, what a system can and can't do, and, like, a system can't force you to feel things. Like, ultimately, it's about the story that you're telling at the table. So the example that I'm going to give here of a really good setting agnostic tabletop RPG is the D100 dice. That's it. That's all you need. So a kind of, like, a younger person who comes to my workplace and was asking me about, like, oh, you know, I want to run One Piece. It's like a pirate-themed anime. Like, I want to run One Piece as a tabletop RPG campaign. What system should I use? And, you know, people were suggesting, you know, either their own proprietary systems or different, you know, sort of like setting agnostic systems, stuff that's easy to run. And I just kind of looked at them and I was like, hey, here's a D100. Here's how it works. Do you know how, like, statistics and percentiles work? Okay, so then talk to your players, figure out, like, what their characters are good at and what they're not good at. And, like, I don't know, like, make a character sheet that has, like, little, like, details from, like, One Piece in it to give them, like, bonuses. And then just be like, all right, you have, you know, a 50% chance to do this thing, roll 50 or under. Or you have a 65% chance to do this thing, run 65 or under. And it's, like, that's it. It's not, you don't need to go out and buy a PDF for the One Piece campaign. You can just kind of make it up as you're going along, because that's the cool thing about tabletop RPGs is you don't need these very structured mechanics. If you're looking for something really light and setting agnostic, you just run a thing. You just use some percentile dice and you make a story together. I said like 10 times in that. This is so scuffed. What I'm trying to say is that setting agnostic tabletop RPGs don't have a good home because they don't need to exist. It's filling a market that doesn't need to be there. It is like, it's fine if you really want to make a setting agnostic thing and, like, you have an idea for, like, oh, it's gonna be, like, so cool and I want everyone to make things in my system, like, okay, go for it. But ultimately, I think the idea of the system that does everything is not just a fruitless journey, but one that is not necessarily needed super hard. And I think that recommending these kinds of systems does players a disservice when they could be kind of making their own stuff up, which I think that culture of creating your own system and taking just tiny little like grains of mechanics and growing from that those seeds something of your own. So for instance, this person who's running their One Piece campaign, they decided to add a mechanic for devil fruits, and they had I think it was like a D20 table for different fruits that you could get. For those who don't know One Piece, you eat the devil fruit, and it gives you like a superpower, essentially. I also haven't watched One Piece. I know the main character's name is Luffy D One Piece, that's about it. But yeah, it's stuff like that where you're able to make your own mechanics as you're playing, and I think dice are a very cool mechanic. I think they're just fun to roll. It's become kind of just part of the hobby, and you don't need a really complex system to be the system for everything. So where am I going with this? Well, to be honest, this is a call-out post for @WaffleboyConnie. That's right, my Twitter mutual. We've got beef, and it's not just the beef in your profile picture. Some context, I work at a game room arcade thing. It's very weird and very fun. But @WaffleboyConnie is one of the folks who I have the pleasure of getting to see a lot of the time at my workplace. And they're making a very cool system called Abiogenesis. I can't talk too much about it because it's still kind of a work in progress. I've gotten to playtest it, and it is absolutely phenomenal, and it includes some incredible mechanics. Now, as I was talking to @WaffleBoy about their system, they kind of mentioned a lot of things that they wanted to do with it, namely that they wanted to take the overarching system and make an SRD out of it. And this was at the time that I was still working on Steelhearts and was also thinking of making an SRD on that. This is kind of a follow-up to why I decided not to make an SRD based off of anything I did in Steelhearts, and also some reflections on why I think that maybe like the SRD culture isn't, like, it's not bad. Like, if you want to make an SRD, like, totally go for it. But I don't think that, like, you need one. And I think Abiogenesis is actually the perfect example. So, in @WaffleBoy system, there is literally my favorite progression mechanic of all time. And we're going to do a video about progression mechanics because I'm really, really picky about them. And I've liked them in, like, a few games. And I don't even really like them a lot in my own games. But Abiogenesis is one of the ones, probably my favorite progression system. Essentially, there are bio points, so it takes place in this pseudo post-apocalyptic kind of deal where humanity has been. It's very transhumanist and very bio-transhumanist, but humanity has pseudo-evolved, and all these components that you can get, all your weapons, all your gear, is biological. So you have bio points to feed your weapons and feed your gear and feed yourself and to upgrade yourself. And that system is so cool. And now there are also subsystems around that. There are 3 stats from which there are derived 3 more stats. And, you roll through a D6 dice pool to resolve certain stuff, etc., etc. And there's a really, really great character sheet with one of my favorite drawings of a person appeared. If this game, when this game comes out, I should say, I'm going to, like, do a whole thing on it because I love it. But while I was talking to @WaffleBoy, we were just discussing like SRDs and making general systems, and they were very interested in taking that core 3 stats that are then derived 3 more stats and making that an SRD, and like, oh, this was just going to be like this setting agnostic system that didn't end up going particularly far. I think they messed around with some other cool systems that used that. But that was never the heart of either of those 2 systems that they did. So they kind of did this like little competitive dating sim experiment, and they did Abiogenesis. And both of those were really strong games. What made them strong was not that like core system that was like, oh, well, this is the setting agnostic thing that can be used anywhere. What made those strong was the bio points in Abiogenesis, and in the dating sim there was a bunch of other like smaller mechanics that I don't have time to explain here, but they were cool. So what I'm trying to get at is that a lot of setting agnostic stuff kind of only just keeps that core. It keeps that like, oh, here's how you roll dice. Here's how you do this really basic thing. Like here's the general conflict resolution mechanic. And I don't think that's what makes systems and tabletop RPGs interesting or good, like the mechanics that I want to read. Like if I'm gonna go out and read a PDF, I want to read something cool like bio points. I want to read, oh, this is my setting, and here is a mechanic that is unique to this setting and uniquely fits this setting perfectly. And you can totally run this in a setting that is like this, but here's a mechanic that is so perfectly like home built for this setting that it will bring your players in that much more, because that's, in my opinion, what a really good mechanic is. And anything that's not that is just something that you could totally make up on your own, and you don't necessarily need the PDF for, because like storytelling and communal game playing is something that comes very naturally to a lot of us. So having those more general things as part of like, this is the setting agnostic tabletop RPG, it doesn't, to me, have the same weight as focusing on those much cooler mechanics. So earlier I mentioned that there were some exceptions, and one of those exceptions that I really want to talk about is Harmony Drive. So Harmony Drive is a ostensibly setting agnostic tabletop RPG. It has a really phenomenal SRD that I really highly recommend you check out. It's available on itch.io. I will definitely put links in the bio. It has honestly become one of my favorite systems that I've played in. It has really interesting conflict resolution mechanics. It's really easy to build encounters for. I would honestly kind of start recommending it as like the first tabletop RPG that people play, just because it is so friendly to just building in your own setting. And the setting that it has been written for at Heroic Chord is also phenomenal. Peach Garden Games did a phenomenal job. I love all their work. Blazing Hymns is really, really good, and I'll probably talk about that another time. But Harmony Drive is interesting because, yes, it is a setting agnostic tabletop RPG, but also it's not, and this is where it gets interesting. So to give you a quick idea of some of the mechanics in Harmony Drive that are common to it is that the general way that conflict resolution happens is that characters can cast spells normally. This is like the big mechanic, in my opinion, that kind of defines the game. Characters can cast spells, and based off of your class, you have a set of spell words, and then based off of the setting and the situation at hand, you have another set of spell words. So, for instance, if I'm a, let's say, Cryomage or whatever, ice might be one of the words in my spell list, and if I'm fighting in a forest, vine might be one of the words that I have available to me. So to cast a spell, all I do is I talk to the DM, and I'm like, okay, here are my 2 words, here are my 2 igniters. I'm going to, from this, craft a new spell, and we're going to discuss how much it costs. I have X amount of exhaustion points, essentially, and if I hit 0, I, faint, or it kind of depends on what kind of setting you want to run. But you have that limited pool that you can use, and depending on how powerful what you're doing is, it'll cost a different amount. And depending on how powerful what you do is, it will get you, several more steps towards your goal. Really simple stuff. But if you look at Harmony Drive and specifically Heroic Chord and a lot of the stuff that's written for it and a lot of the ways the mechanics are written, the game is, yes, it is system agnostic, but there is a message behind it. Those mechanics do 2 things. And in fact, the SRD really emphasizes these 2 things. One, it's about player creativity and self-expression. So the system is about self-expression. So we'll table that. Secondly, the system is about sacrifice. It is about what you are willing to trade. It is about calculated loss. It's about the fact that, there's a system, specifically I think in Heroic Chord, called Scatter, and this is also included in the Harmony Drive SRD, where you have these kind of special points that you can use for like extra powerful abilities, but every time you use them, you gain a little bit of Scatter. And the more you go into Scatter, the more you kind of lose yourself and detach yourself from the party. So it's, again, this element of sacrifice. So we have self-expression and sacrifice. And those 2 things, while very general and can apply to a lot of settings, that to me is not purely setting agnostic. It means that this system is actually built very well for telling 2 kinds of stories, and they're stories about sacrifice and self-expression. And so, there are definitely certain stories and certain campaigns that I do not think would fit Harmony Drive well. But that's good. That's what makes, in my opinion, a good tabletop RPG, or like a good, like specifically mechanically driven tabletop RPG, is that it has mechanics that like really can evoke not specifically certain emotions, but really gravitate heavily towards certain emotions. And I think the power of a setting agnostic RPG is one that builds itself like firmly around those emotions, so that if you are similarly making a, tabletop RPG, so for instance, I am currently in the midst of writing something that's very .hack inspired, in Harmony Drive, because I read Harmony Drive and I was like, oh my god, like what I loved from .hack and what I love about sort of the losing yourself in an MMO, virtual MMO kind of setting is so perfect here, because kind of what I've always seen virtual MMOs kind of being is, on the one hand, you have self-expression and sort of this limitless potential, and on the other hand, you are losing yourself into the game, you are sacrificing time and energy that you could be spending elsewhere in your real life, and so this system was perfect for that. But that just kind of goes to show that, I couldn't have just been like, oh, it's VR, full dive, Sora Online, we'll do it in GURPS. It was because this system was specific and thus like less agnostic that it worked so well. What I'm saying is you should read Harmony Drive. It's really good, and the SRD has a lot of really good igniters. This is one of the best tabletop RPG PDFs I've ever read. I will probably do a longer video on it because it's really good, but you should. It's too late for me to describe all the ways that it's good. Just trust me on this. I literally would not have written NetRealms, which I'm currently working on, if I had not read this SRD. It's good. Just check it. Just check it out. It's free. All right, so I think it's time we addressed one of the elephants in the room. So there were a lot of events that happened over the past 5 months that are really why I wanted to talk about the setting agnostic tabletop RPG. And of course, one of them has to do with a very beloved video game that has been in the public discourse a lot. And, a lot of people have been talking about this game, and I've been thinking about it a lot in terms of tabletop RPGs and setting agnostic stuff, and that's Fortnite. But before we can talk about Fortnite, I do have to mention the whole Dark Souls thing that's happening, because I guess that's still kind of relevant. So Dark Souls, as many of you know, is getting a tabletop RPG done by Steamforged Games that's going to be in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, but also they're gutting most of the mechanics from Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. So one wonders, why are you making it in 5th edition to begin with? And I don't really know. It's probably just for money and for Kickstarter sales. And the whole project is kind of sleazy, because you could have just translated the Japanese one, because that Japanese one sounds really, really good, and I've heard nothing but good things. But that is beside the point. The point is that Dark Souls feels like the perfect example of a game that can't really be just slotted into a setting agnostic tabletop RPG, because what Dark Souls is very specific to its mechanics. Its mood and message is defined by its mechanics. So that's a big phrase in sort of video game design theory, is the messages and the mechanics. In Dark Souls, the kind of constant futility and dying and repeating and sense of mastery you get after progressing through the game after a certain point is a huge part of what makes it unique, and every kind of like detail, and especially kind of the isolation in that game, which is why I'm interested to see how it goes as a tabletop RPG. But especially the isolation in that game creates a real ambiance, along with its mechanics of, dying and hollowing. And you can't just slap that in GURPS or Fate or Savage Worlds and expect it to work any better than D&D 5e. So I'm kind of making this because I think I need to kind of I'm seeing people dunk on 5e a lot, and I love dunking on 5e. I have a whole thing dunking on 5e. Whatever, cool. You get it out of your system. It's worth it. But I think that there's a bigger issue at hand sometimes when people dunk on 5e and they're like, oh, Fate's fine. You just run Dark Souls and Fate. That'll work great. So part of my whole thing here is I do want to start a conversation about what mechanics can do for you in a tabletop RPG, because I find that a lot of these setting agnostic games are literally tabletop RPGs sans those mechanics. They've sort of stripped those mechanics out, and then you can buy modules that slot those mechanics in, but those mechanics are what make those systems interesting, because if you don't have that, you might as well be running something super rules light, or even just running your own thing and doing the D100 percentile and just kind of making stuff up as you go along. That's the magic of tabletop RPGs, is you can just do that. And this is not to smack people who want to use Fate and GURPS. If that's what feels comfortable to you and your group, then it's working. That's awesome, and it's working for your setting and your playstyle and your table. I think there's a few too many people who start recommending these setting agnostic tabletop RPGs for people who are just starting out, and I just really think that's bad advice. I think going for something setting agnostic as your first thing, like you just no, just run something, just run a made up thing, roll a d20, and just say yeah, it's close to 20. You jumped over the cliff. That's tabletop RPGs. You don't need a setting agnostic thing to tell you how to run that, and a lot of those setting agnostic things, I guess they're good for cons. Okay, we need to talk about Fortnite. So, for those of you who have somehow missed the cultural event that is Fortnite, it is a ostensibly a free-to-play battle royale game made by Epic Games. I can't believe I'm explaining this, and it involves 100 people going on to the battle bus and dropping on an island and shooting at each other, and you can collect resources and build a base. But you never end up building a base. It's just a bunch of 12-year-olds who can build towers way faster than you. It's a time. It's interesting. I've played a not insignificant amount of it at this point, partially because of my job, just because I've had the time on slow nights to kind of get into it. And I gotta say, I have stared into the abyss, and the abyss has stared back. I promise you this is relevant. Just like stick with me for like 30 to 40 more seconds here. So one of the things that has garnered Fortnite a lot of popularity, especially recently in the past couple of years, is that it has become an amalgamation of settings. Everything from Dune to Spider-Man to Master Chief and Kratos and Bruno Mars and Katy Perry. And I actually don't know if she was in it, but I know the friggin'... there's a lot of music. I think Take Me On is technically in there, and there's flossing and there's dabbing, and any Ariana Grande, that was the name of the musician. I got a quest from her last season because that's how genuinely odd this game is. It is like a fever dream, and it is all these settings, all these intellectual properties of settings. That's important for later. Smushed together. It is, in many ways, setting agnostic. Yes, it does have a predefined setting. It does have a predefined set of rules. And yes, it is wildly weird to see Sasuke Uchiha holding a gun and just mowing down Rick from Rick and Morty. It's odd. None of it ever makes sense because the game and the setting and the game and the system and the mechanics are not built to tell the stories that any of these IPs are from. This setting agnostic system is built to sell you things. When we have a setting agnostic tabletop RPG, a lot of the times we have the same thing. When you get into Fate, you are not getting into Fate as a system, you are getting into Fate as a platform to create an install base to buy Fate's worlds. All these different offshoot settings that you then collect into one thing. Same with Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. I think one of the biggest reasons that 5e has so many Kickstarter campaigns is because it's the setting agnostic tabletop RPG that can just kind of catch all and create a huge install base to have people buy more things for that thing. D&D 5e, even just on its own, when you look at the number of books and the number of modules that they're up to, it is a platform for selling more books. So Marcia B, who I'll link her article down there somewhere, she has a really phenomenal little bit about how like the history of D&D and sort of like because D&D has kind of defined the hobby, the history of the hobby is a history of people trying to sell books. And to me, the setting agnostic tabletop RPG, a lot of the times, it's just try and sell books. It's not these settings, these systems. They're not there to do anything. They're not substantive in any meaningful way. Harmony Drive is really cool because it is substantive in a lot of ways, but as a result, it pigeonholes itself into what it can do. Fate, I've never really gotten that impression. And there's even other stuff that's indie that I'm not really, like, I need to play test some of that stuff to really judge it. But I definitely see this sort of thing a lot where there's people who are making, setting agnostic things that aren't substantive. It's just like, oh well, here's my proprietary system for thing, and it's like, yeah, okay, your proprietary system's all right, but like I'm much more interested in thing, and oftentimes the proprietary system is just to sell you thing and to sell you more versions of thing and more colors of thing. I just thought of another really good example of a system agnostic tabletop RPG that doesn't do this. Hey, it's back. It's back. It's Rodrigo Fist. I love this game. Look at the cute anime and the bass. Yeah, Rodrigo Fist. Genuinely. Technically, setting agnostic. You can. It's got a sci-fi campaign. It's got all kinds of amazing campaigns, literally packed and baked into the book, which is cool because like I'm not against tabletop RPGs that want to just pack themselves with content. Content's nice. It's fun. I can do a whole thing about that, but. Rod Rail and Fist is not concerned with selling itself as, oh, this is the setting agnostic thing. It's a game about fishing. If you don't want to run fishing, you will not enjoy Rod Rail and Fist. And it's not a system that's built with the sense of like, oh, well, we'll just have like a gajillion additions to this. It's like, no, it's built because fishing is rad and there aren't enough fishing tabletop RPGs. So it just packs everything you need, all the settings. If I don't know, like this does not feel the same way that, reading through the Fate PDF feels. This feels like something that is like meaningful in its setting agnosticness because it's giving you the tools to do something specific and tell a specific story regardless of setting, as opposed to saying, hey, here's how you do a skill check. It's slightly different than D&D, and it's setting agnostic. Buy our books. I knew this video was going to upset someone, probably. There's definitely like a Fate fan out there who's like, Fate does things that are different meaningfully. And I haven't played enough Fate to know. I, again, mostly have played it at cons, so maybe it's just I've gotten a bad experience. But like, let me use a system that I have played with, which is like not setting agnostic. So those of you who know Edge of the Empire know it as we're going to sell Dice Simulator, but the dice system's really like cool and like tactilely fun, but also like wildly inaccessible. I'm going to do a whole thing on custom dice at some point, but from Edge of the Empire. Okay, so to give you an idea, Edge of the Empire is about custom dice pools. So these custom dice have different values on them, pluses, minuses. God, I wonder what this sounds like. Pluses, minuses, and also these like, triumphs and, disadvantages. And Edge of the Empire is Star Wars themed, and it's very cool. To my awareness, Edge of the Empire was then succeeded by something called Genesis, which uses the same dice system, but instead of making it proprietary to Star Wars and flavored to Star Wars, it says we're setting agnostic. And frankly, looking back on Edge of the Empire, the campaign I played in was a blast. There was nothing specific about the system that felt super Star Wars-y. It was, again, just like, here's another method we have for conflict resolution. And it's different than Dungeons and Dragons. Buy our books. And I really don't want to get anyone down. Like, if you have a really cool idea for a setting agnostic tabletop RPG, like, please 100% go for it. Again, I really brought up Harmony Drive because it is a perfect example of something that is doing something really cool and different. And I actually really like the conflict resolution mechanics in that, but it is very much theming itself as something and is doing something different. It's not just, here's a way to roll dice and have a success failure, and like sometimes like, oh gosh, there's like a sort of success in the middle. Whether you make your own tabletop RPGs or you play in them a bunch, I just want you to consider what you're trying to get from setting agnostic tabletop RPGs, or what you feel like you're getting from them, and what you're trying to give if you want to put one out, versus, making something that's more specific. I think setting specific tabletop RPGs end up being phenomenal. Stuff that is setting specific can do so much more with its mechanics and tell a very focused story just from the mechanical side of things. So that way when you get to the table, people are a lot more quickly onboarded and they're like, okay, this is the kind of, setting we're doing. This is the kind of story we're telling. And it kind of, it adds another spice into the great cauldron that you and your table are cooking together. I think cooking metaphors always work well in tabletop RPGs, and I think setting agnostic stuff is like saying something setting agnostic is being like, this is our salt. It's like, cool, yeah, salt's important. Like conflict resolution stuff, like you can cook without salt, you can cook with salt, or salt or oil, like either of those. Like, yeah, it's important. It's not does not the whole meal make. It's all about the specific ingredients and the specific things that you're trying to do. I would love to do another video at some point about setting specific mechanics and why I think mechanics in tabletop RPGs can be really cool and meaningful, and why I would love to see more people design around that space, and also design around that space in a way that is not custom dice, because I mess with custom dice because I love the idea of custom dice, and I love all the custom dice I own. Custom dice are really expensive and really accessible, and you can do a lot of the same cool stuff that custom dice do without doing custom dice while still making it accessible. And we'll talk about that another time. But for now, I hope this has given you some food for thought. This went super long, and I hope you've enjoyed it. And I hope that the next time you pick up something that's setting specific, you can appreciate what it is doing that is specific to the story it's trying to tell and the genre is trying to emulate, or whatever that setting specific tabletop RPG is trying to do. I hope that you can kind of appreciate it a little bit more, that you cannot run Dark Souls in that, and that's probably for the better.